find out more information about how to join us, that would be a really great idea. Joining the Keats-Shelley Association by looking at this postcard that we're distributing from that table out there. So welcome all to what I know will be an intellectually stimulating afternoon. I'm really excited about this. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Just a quick word to add my welcome as President of the Byron Society of America, and my thanks to everyone who's organized and to all the speakers at the session. This is a great time to be a Romanticist. All these 200th anniversaries of things are happening, and it's really an exciting time. Lots of events to look forward to. So please do look at the romantics200.org website, which is a kind of comprehensive guide to all of this over the coming years through 2024. If we all live that long, watch for 2019. Don Juin, Byron there'll be some major programming going on around that. It's being planned now. In the near term, November 2nd, out at Drew University, the Byron Society is hosting a celebration of Leslie Marchand's life and work, the great Byron scholar. There will be a lecture, a Marchand lecture by Hermione Dalmida. There will be a book launch of this book. There's a flyer out in the lobby. A Legacy in Byron Studies. It is a series of lectures given, the named lectures named after Leslie Marchand. You can find out more there. So I hope to see some of you at the November 2nd event. Again, you can find out about all of that, our particular activities, at our website, byronsociety.org. Easy to remember, byronsociety.org. Yeah, as I say, this is a great time to be involved with both of our societies, Keats-Shelley and Byron. We have joined together for all of these anniversaries over the next, 6 to 7 years as a starting point. And I hope that you'll join us. So again, welcome, and I'm going to turn things over to Susan Wilson.
Well, just quickly, I want to thank you all for coming, especially on this gorgeous spring afternoon, especially our heroic travelers from faraway Maryland and Boston and D.C., Long Island, central New Jersey. I know a lot of you had unexpected ordeals in getting here, so a special welcome to you. Yeah, this is a beautiful summer day in this season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, though it seems warm days will never cease. We're delighted to have you here, especially for this great harvest of thinking and caring about Keats in 1817. And his extraordinary presence among us in 2017. I'll be doing the cleanup, and in case your attention cells have gone out by then, or like me, you're a better reader than listener, there are plans to have the proceedings of today in Keats-Shelley Journal in the 2018 issue. The subscription comes automatically with membership in the Keats-Shelley Association, and there are several membership categories depending on your abilities to become a member. So go to k-saa.org, and you will find options for membership. Stanley Plumley's book is available for your looking at out in the lobby with order forms. It's Stan's latest collection of poems against autumn, a very Keatsian theme, a very Stan theme, and it is saturated with Keatsian riffs, Keatsian thinking, Keatsian imaginations. My book is also out there with an order form too, but enough about us. Let's get to everybody else. So first session, take it away. Yeah, this is Julie Camarda who's going to get things going for us.
Hello, and welcome to our first panel on Keats's 1817 volume simply titled Poems. My name is Julie Camarda, as has been said, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. I'll introduce them as they'll be presenting, and then we'll just take it away. First, we'll have Jonathan Mulrooney, who is Professor of English at the College of the Holy Cross, and he has just completed 6 years as Department Chair. He has published many articles on Keats in the Cockney Circle, including How Keats Falls, which was in the 25th anniversary special issue of Studies in Romanticism on Keats and Politics. His book, Romanticism and Theatrical Experience, Kean, Hazlitt, and Keats in the Age of Theatrical News, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. He is currently at work on a book entitled Keats's Vanishing Figures, and his paper today is Keats's 1817 Occasions. Next, we will have Brian Rejak, is Associate Professor of English at Illinois State University. He has published essays in European Romantic Review, 19th Century Context, Romanticism, Romantic Circles Pedagogy Commons, and Romantic Circles Praxis Series, among other venues. He is one of the founding co-editors of the Keats Letters Project, as we've heard, ongoing bicentennial chronicling of Keats's epistolary output, accessible at keatsletterproject.org, or .com, pardon me. And he is co-editor with Michael Tooney of an essay collection, Dispositions, Reading Negative Capability, 1817 to 2017, hopefully out sometime next year. His paper today, Keats's Poetics of Secretion, is part of an in-progress monograph titled John Keats and Romantic Imaginary Media, The Secrets of Wondrous Things. And last, we'll have Duncan Wu, who is Raymond Wagner Professor of Literary Studies at Georgetown University. He is a contributor to the Cambridge Companion to John Keats, edited by Susan Wolfson, and to Keats in Context, edited by Michael O'Neill. His paper today is titled Constructing Keats. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Hi. I really can't tell you what an honor it is and a privilege it is to be here with all of you as I look around the room. And thanks to Susan and Billy and Kate and John for the invitation. The minds that are in this room, let alone the ones that are watching around the world, are really somewhat intimidating. So let's see how this goes. So the title of my paper is Keats' 1817 Occasions, with the 1817 in italics. So the volume as such. Let's see where that takes us. There is, I think, a still prevailing idea that the differences between Keats' 1817 and 1820 volumes mark the progress of the young poet of the Hunt Circle, situated as he was amidst its Cockney sociable encounters and its publications, most notably The Examiner, toward the poet of more mature historical engagement, via the philosophical abstraction, complex rhetorical modes of address, and high figurality we find in the romances, and most especially in the odes. The usual esteemed suspects, I use that term lovingly, Cox, Rowe, Kusich, Susan Wolfson, among others, rightly place emphasis on the occasional nature of the poems 1817 comprises as evidence of Keats's early sociable enthusiasms, principally his movement from the Matthew Circle to the Hunt Circle. Variations on the theme exist, of course, but Cox sums it up nicely in his introduction to the Norton Keats. Quote, Keats finds inspiration in Hunt's books, the music that fills the house, the prints, bust, the portraits that decorated it, and in Hunt's most ridiculed sonnet contests. The occasional nature of many of these poems is key for these historically minded critics, and formerly minded critics, principally because the poems named inspirations, people, events, cultural actions of reading or viewing art, illustrate Keats's developing aesthetic politics. But I wish today to explore this notion of occasionalism from a different angle, to argue that we can attend more fully, beyond the historical occasions that inform particular poems, to the way in which the 1817 volume stages, as a book, Keats's profound commitment to poetry's investment in the occasion as such. My concern then is not so much specific dates, times, persons, and places, though that's, of course, a part of it. Rather, I speculate on how the 1817 poems offer sustained attention to occasion as a means of resisting the historical narratives the age was so keen to produce, and from which Keats and many of his cohort had been excluded. It is not that occasion denies the possibility of historical engagement as such, but rather that it reframes such engagement as bound to what Keats would call the poetry of earth. To illustrate the tension between these different kinds of historical engagement, I turn to a brief passage from Book 1 of Endymion, which was composed almost contemporaneously with the release of poems in March 1817. As Keats himself noted, the long poem takes narrative waywardness as its structural premise. This is a famous quote from the letters, but I'll give it anyway, just so it's fresh in our minds. Writing to Benjamin Bailey that October, Keats asked, quote, "Do not the lovers of poetry like to have a little region to wander in where they may pick and choose, and in which the images are so numerous that many are forgotten and found new in a second reading, which may be food for a week's stroll in the summer?" This emphasis on wandering and forgetting, the desire to instill wandering and forgetting in the reader, contains within itself the seeds of Keats's later lyric innovation, showing his movement toward a poetry in which the appearance and vanishing of figures becomes a primary effect. So this is a sort of tip toward the larger project from which this paper comes. And the backstory is that I'm considering occasionalism as part of Keats's interest in vanishing. So the later vanishings that preside over the odes and later poems, I would claim, manifest the same occasionalist principle on display in more kind of evidently or explicitly in the earlier poetry. So I want to draw a through line here. And this is the first part of it. In Book 1 of Endymion, immediately following the famous or infamous hymn to Pan, which Keats would recite for Wordsworth in December 1817, the narrator presents the following scene. This is number 1 on your handout, for those of you who are in the room. Meantime, on shady levels, mossy fine, young companies nimbly began dancing to the swift treble pipe and humming string. Aye, those fair living forms swam heavenly to tunes forgotten, out of memory. Fair creatures, whose young children's children bred Thermopylae its heroes, not yet dead, but in old marbles ever beautiful. High genitors, unconscious did they call time's sweet first fruits. They danced to weariness, and then in quiet circles did they press the hillock turf, and caught the latter end of some strange history, potent to send a young mind from its bodily tenement. Meantime, at line 312, introduces a temporal recursion, an incursion of, or alignment of, one occasion onto another, because the dance overlaps the hymn's ending and brings the reader back to the passage she has just completed reading, in which, and this is the underlined passage at the beginning of handout number 1, in which even while they brought the burden to a close, a shout from the whole multitude arose that lingered in the air like dying rolls of abrupt thunder, when Ionian shoals of dolphins bobbed their noses through the brine. Even while the final part of the hymn is sung, and for those of you who are just listening to this and to have no visual, I'm going to be doing air quotes occasionally, so just imagine that. Even while the final part of the hymn is sung, a response issues as a shout like thunder, itself both abrupt and lingering, and in that same meantime, a dance, as we discover in the end, in that same meantime also a, quote, strange history, of which the tired dancers hear only, quote, the latter end. Here, Keats's dancing figures are embedded in, but also vex, the larger poem's narrative trajectory. The tunes to which the young companies dance stand outside the compass of the narratives of our knowledge. They are forgotten, quote, out of memory. The poem's readers perceive the dance through a future history that is our past. Their children's children bred Thermopylae, our past, but these children are not yet dead, their future. When physical action gives way to contemplation, it does so only in part, and it is the weary catching of some strange history's latter end that enables brief cessation of bodily movement as the dancers catch their breath. All of this is punctuated by the pun on I, which means yes, but also forever, in line 315. So you can see these sort of various temporal layerings that are going on here. Thus, even as the poem enlists readers, quote, ripe for high contemplating, it does so in a way that asks those readers to cast their lot with the mode of experience the dancers enact, one in which narrative progress and lyric freedom give way to each other in a kind of almost, it might seem, endless round. I do not mean to provide, thankfully, a reading of Endymion in all its 4,000 lines, but I would claim that this moment exemplifies the poem's interest in developing the possibilities afforded by the lyric occasionalism, call it if you please, an expositional waywardness, that defines 1817 as a volume. So where Andrew Bennett sees in Endymion a host of, and there's various Bennett quotes here, dilatory dead ends, a lack of generative narrative energies, and a neglect of narrative form, itself a neglect of or refusal to acknowledge audience in Endymion, I would like to find a generative and generous impulse toward writing that enacts that other famous Keatsian injunction, memory should not be called knowledge. This might be an excuse for my having a very difficult time always, even when I teach it, remembering the plot of Endymion. But there you go. We are defined in Keats's way of proceeding as much by what we forget and the ways in which we forget as by what we retain, as much by what passes us by in a moment's occasion, as much by what we miss as what we catch. Wandering, dancing, sleeping by the wayside, for Endymion and his nymphs, for Keats and his readers, these are the point. With its multiple narrative trajectories and turnings, its hunt-like prosody, and its suburban mythologies, Endymion has long been considered a kind of way station in Keats's development toward the image-laden prosodic economy of the later poems. When juxtaposed to the liturgical hymn to Pan that immediately precedes it in the poem, Wordsworth's perception of that hymn should not be forgotten. The description of history's being, quote, caught only as the after effect of a dance party privileges occasion over narrative, I would argue, and thus functions even more strikingly as an allegory of Keatsian reading that we will find praised in Ode on Indolence and exemplified in To Autumn, among other places. Thus, the same attention to occasion I have described appears, albeit in different guises, throughout the 1820 volume. Considered as a whole, in fact, the 1820 volume presents a picture of a post-narrative poet whose aesthetic commitments resonate with those manifested by the author of 1817 and by the Keats of 1817 year. But that is another story for another year. Today, I will advance my speculation by turning back towards 1817 to claim it as a book that not only comprises multiple kinds of occasionalist poems, the epistles, dedicatory sonnets, sonnets about the occasion of Keats's reading or viewing art, or sonnet writing contests themselves, but as a collective testimony to a life of occasion rather than of narrative. This obtains both with respect to how individual poems operate and with respect to the volume's arrangement as a whole. There are many ways into such a discussion, but for now, let me offer a few examples of the way Keats almost always aligns time, quote unquote, with instance throughout the book. And I think we have this wonderful, this is not news to anybody, we have this wonderful thing in English where time means both duration and instance, and that's not the same in a lot of other languages. So there's an ambiguity there. So aside from poems repeatedly insisting on their status as a response to a particular incident, think of On Receiving a Curious Shell, On First Looking Into, Chapman's Homer, or Missive to Some Ladies, To Leigh Hunt, or Insistence, Lo, I Must Tell a Tale of Chivalry, there is an insistence on the present that shows time and again. So I'm just going to go through a few examples, and these are all on your handout. From the Epistle to George Felton Matthew, the philosophical claim, quote, sweet are the pleasures that diverse belong, and doubly sweet the brotherhood and song, gives way to, number 2, but might I now each passing moment give to the coy muse? With me, she would not live in this dark city, nor would condescend mid contradictions her delights to end. Should e'er the fine-eyed maid be kind, ah, surely it must be whene'er I find some flowery spot, sequestered, wild, romantic, that often must have seen the poet frantic. Here, now, gives way to a time measured as each passing moment, and later in the passage, ere becomes the more particular instance of whene'er, that with often, quote unquote, itself recalls previous instances of poets finding the spot Keats seeks. Another example. The verse epistle to my brother George actually begins with an emphasis on instance. Full many a dreary hour have I passed, my brain bewildered and my mind o'ercast with heaviness. But there are times when those that love the bay fly from all sorrowing far, far away. A sudden glow comes on them. Naught they see in water, earth, or air, but poesy. And Calidore, anticipating the later romances and the bending of past into present that we find in, say, Eve of St. Agnes, insists with its present tenseness throughout on the now. Young Calidore is paddling over the lake, his healthful spirit eager and awake to feel the beauty of the silent eve. And now the sharp keel of his little boat comes up with ripple, and with easy float and glides into a bed of water lilies. And now he turns a jutting point of land, whence may be seen the castle gloomy and grand. And I think all of those kind of strange temporalities in play really anticipate, for example, right, the last two stanzas of Eve of St. Agnes. I take these instances from the volume's first and second sections, along with the explicitly occasional nature of the sonnets in section 3 and the perspectiveness of sleep and poetry, chastened by the occasion of sleep in section 4, as shorthand for the scene of reading that 1817 stages as a book. Here I would invoke Christina Lupton's recent consideration of the book as a physical object that, when read, invites the reader to an encounter with contingent life. Quote, this is Lupton, its pages bound and yet open to permutation, modeling the condition of contingency belonging to a narrative that makes openness a condition of its own formal closure. For Lupton, the paradigmatic form of this operation is the 18th century novel, but I would claim that 1817 stages a similar kind of encounter, and Emily Roebuck has an excellent piece coming out on the sonnets that attends to some of these same issues coming out in the article. The attention to occasion I have briefly charted, as well as Keats's deployment of the multiple closures of couplet form, the time sonnet, and epistle, puncture the possibility of a consolidated history that would elide the contingency occasional poetry embraces. 1817, the volume, repeatedly affirms, to echo Lupton again, the ways in which, quote, a thing is so, but need not have been so. Here it is worth pointing out that I diverge markedly, and I've been using romantic occasionalism, the term, a lot, so I need to address this, from Carl Schmitt's use of the term in political romanticism. Schmitt argues that romanticism is subjectified occasionalism. In other words, this is Schmitt, in the romantic subject treats the world as an occasion and an opportunity for his romantic productivity, end quote. Yet if that process does not mean that the external world is negated, in Schmitt's terms, still, quote, every concrete point of the external world can be the elastic point. In other words, the beginning of the romantic novel, the occasio for the adventure, the point of departure for the fanciful game. Thus, romanticism for Schmitt resides almost entirely in illusion and, quote, has no interest in really changing the world. But just where Schmitt finds the subjugation of political consciousness to a radically imagined individuality, I would argue that we find occasionalist engagements with the affective experiences that actually comprise history as it is lived. What is truly heroic, to echo another theorist of contingency, Gary Saul Morson, is the unhistoric. This part of my argument is haunted by Badiou and the notion of the event, and also by the question of necessity. I say haunted because I certainly haven't worked it all out yet. Kurt Hessel and Gillette Stevenson wrote a really wonderful piece recently on Shelley and necessity, and that's had me thinking in different ways about this. So I realize there's a lot of stuff floating around here. Indeed, informed by Lupton and Morson, we might claim that Keats' 1817 volume and the 1817 thoughts that we see accompanying it in his composition that year of Endymion consolidates the kinds of temporalities Lupton describes as defining the 18th century novel, and anticipates Morson's Tolstoy in his 19th century insistence on the quotidian as the primary means of encountering the unnarratability of life. And Billy Galford's book is present here too. The act of reading 1817 thus becomes itself an experience of occasionalism, a coming to awareness of the material event of holding the book, sitting down, reading, responding. Keats's Chapman's Homer and King Lear sonnets exemplify this most vividly, and this is what Emily Roebuck's writing about, but so do others. Not with the effect Schmitt describes of opting out of history into solipsistic quiescence, but on the contrary, of opting into history's narrative incommensurability. In this, it also participates in the kind of limited or adjusted utopian formulations that Anna Heed Nersession has so compellingly described in her recent book. Indeed, though Nersession's and Morson's political trajectories are apposite, or nearly opposite, they share a resistance to happy futurities that takes its cue from what Nersession, following Northrop Frye, calls the always foreshortened RCSM. Rather than simply viewing poems as responses to particular events, that is, Keats develops a mode of figuration throughout the 1817 volume that displays poetry's historically, always incomplete, always occasional, mediating operations. Thus, to return to Lupton one more time, quote, the book becomes a sign of the hard distinction between the real world of chance and the plot that will arrive inevitably at its conclusion, as well as of the more circumscribed power that page-turning instills in the reader. If we follow this line of thinking through the formulation of negative capability, late in 1817, Keats's commentary, I have a note here, Keene. Yes, Keene's always in the background for me. So his obsession with negative capability, Shakespeare v. Edmund Keene, and Keats' commentary on the Veil of Soul-Making 2 years later, which is inspired by his speculation that, quote, circumstances are like clouds, we might find that we still too readily consider, and what is more, too readily teach, such foundational Keatsian notions as coherent abstract principles, rather than as mediations of and meditations upon the contingent and passing occasions that human life comprises. Seeing 1817 as a volume dedicated to occasion can help us correct this in us. Nick Rowe has a wonderful observation about the well-known Spenserian epigraph of the volume, right? What more felicity can fall to a creature than to enjoy delight with liberty? But those lines are succeeded by what follows in Spenser, quote, the least mishap, the most bliss can alter. Here I am touching on new work by Billy Galperin on the everyday and Lily Burton Wachter on heightened attention. In 1817, Keats attends to the quotidian realities that inform sensory and affective experience, even as his figurations simultaneously refuse a mindless descent into an affective regime and resist the embrace of developmental personal or historical narratives that ignore human contingency. I close with a brief comment, here again following Morrison, on the indispensable commitment we as teachers of literature must make toward introducing our students to contingency, and of the value, especially now, and of the value of Keatsian attention to occasion in learning it. If many of our students are rather like Paul de Man's version of Keats, evincing a, quote, always prospective gaze that attends upon a future they can see all too well, but not imaginatively envision, the Keats of 1817 and of 1817 provides a model of respite from circumscribed futures and assured narratives, offering instead the hope born of and born by occasion, which is to say by limit, by surprise, by play, and by the poems that show it to us. Thank you.
Bear with me for a second. Get all my stuff set up here. And also, quick shameless plug for the Keats Letters Project, which is helping co-editors. I believe the letter that you quoted to Bailey is October 8th, 1817. So tomorrow, watch for a response to that letter from Devin Parker. Shameless plug out of the way. So. Lest you fear that this paper will gross you out with descriptions of oozings and precious bodily fluids, let me first explain what I mean by poetics of secretion. Of course, Keats's poetry is not without attention to such bodily things, and one frequent critique of the early poems in particular is their excessive sensuousness, which some readers even deem a kind of boyish masturbatory fantasizing, or as Lord Byron so famously and eloquently deemed it, breaking the imagination. My concern is rather different. Drawing on the etymology of the word, by secretion I mean simply the act of separation, of secreting away one thing from another. Now, my inspiration for thinking about Keats's poetry in these terms comes from the closing poem of the 1817 volume, Swaithman Poetry, in which he writes that poetry comes to us like a gentle whispering of all the secrets of some wondrous thing that breathes about us in the vacant air. And in short, these lines characterize what I argue about Keats's 1817 volume. The poems repeatedly demonstrate Keats's sophisticated thinking about mediation, especially its insistence that aspects of mediation appear hidden or unknowable or incomplete in the way that you're talking about occasion, and that they operate through separation as much as through connection. So in these lines from Swaithman Poetry, the vacant air is the space of breathing secretive things which are divided from us and from each other, but which, through the middle ground of media, manage to secrete something of themselves that undergoes a translation into poetry via further mediated and mediating objects. And one such object is the 1817 volume we're discussing on this panel. Before I proceed further and elaborate my argument with additional illustrations, I'll speak to some of the states as I see them for treating the 1817 poems in this manner. It's probably fair to say that there's a common critical assumption that early Keats is bad Keats. Now, we may not go quite so far as Swinburne in 1886, when he contrasts the Ode to a Nightingale, one of the finest masterpieces of human work, with the early poems, which he describes as such. Some of the most vulgar, what happened? Oh, sorry. My monitor stopped giving me, I mean, I can sort of do this, but then I have to look at that all the time. So it's kind of like, okay, so I have to keep touching the, Is it gonna go?
Oh, for life sensation.
And you don't touch this.
Yeah, but is it gonna go blank again?
No, it's gonna go back.
Okay, all right, sorry about that. Problem with talking about mediation and trying to do something clever with mediation. So, all right. So did I finish reading the Swinburne quotation?
No.
Wholesome doggerel ever whimpered by a vapid and effeminate rhymes are in the sickly stage of wellhood. My point there is that we're probably not going to that extreme in how we deem Keats's early poetry, but contemporary Keats scholarship and teaching still tend to prioritize the late poetry over the early, and moreover, we tend to read Keats's career as a narrative of rapid and consistent progress from immature and bad to mature and good. And despite landmark work by Nick Rowe and Jeff Cox in the late 90s, in which they both offered readings of Keats's early work by resisting governing assumptions about the poet's development from bad to good Keats, we still seem to suffer the effects of a 200-year hangover brought on by the dewy wine of Blackwood's critical judgments begun in the Cockney School attacks 200 years ago this month. All kinds of bicentennial celebrations, or one has to be aware of them. Now, I'm not trying to say that I prefer Give Me Women, Wine, and Snuff over To Autumn, but I do think that there are things to be gained from resisting the allure of the progressive narrative, which necessarily views the early poetry as failures to be later overcome. One thing gained is that our bicentennial celebration of Keats in 2017 can revel in the youthfulness, the vitality, the freshness of Keats's rapid emergence without feeling compelled to look forward to the grisly death just a few years out. And this has been one of the things I've enjoyed about the Keats Letters project in these early letters, is just seeing the liveliness and vitality that's there and not feeling like we have to move towards the tragic right away. Okay, second, there are many things there may be things Keats does as well or better in 1817 than in 1819. And it's hard to see those things if our sense of the mature poetry's attributes conditions which youthful blossomings we attend to in the early ones. What if Keats's writing and thinking on mediation are just as advanced in the 1817 volume as they are at any other moment in his writing career? Not sure what I think the answer to that question is yet. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to discuss Keats and mediation, and I think in part because of the high esteem in which the letters have long been held, attention to Keats's thinking on the epistolary medium has a long history. So I'm thinking of, for instance, essays from the late 70s and early 80s by David Luke and Susan Wolfson. However, as Yohei Igarashi pointed out in a 2014 SIR essay, quote, communicative mediation constitutes a significant, although still largely unremarked, concern of Keats's poetry and letters. And I agree that more attention ought to be paid to the significance and even the centrality of mediation in Keats's body of work. Romanticists have more broadly recognized the period as a crucial moment in the history of mediation, and Andrew Burkett's book from last year, Romantic Mediations, serves as an important condensation of and extension upon other scholarship in Romantic media studies from the last 2 decades or so, including work by Kevin Goodman, Celeste Langen, Maureen McLean, Andrew Piper, and others. I'd suggest that as Romantic media studies continues to develop, Keats ought to serve as a signal figure. Again, focusing on Keats's interest in mediation offers one way to treat the early poetry on its own terms without the necessity of finding something therein which he improves upon with the mature late poetry. So back to the 1817 volume. It's no secret that the poems collected in this volume tend to share one common interest, poetry itself. Walter Jackson Bate calls these poems poetry about trying to write poetry, and Marjorie Levinson notes most of the 1817 poems are about their own coming into being, and then adds this lovely caveat. One hesitates to say about when the reflexiveness is so essential. What strikes me about the reflexiveness of the poems in this volume, though, is how consistently Keats reflects on poetry as a medium, while also exploring other related media. The 1817 poems are full of textual media, books, pages, portfolios, tablets, as well as audio and visual media, voices, harps, busts, engravings. But I'd actually like to focus on mediation through one of Keats's recurring images that is less obviously connected with media, and that's reflective, watery surfaces. So the first instance of this occurs in the volume's first long poem, I Stood Tiptoe, in which one of the luxuries cataloged is the scene of some bending planks that lean against a streamlet's brushy banks. Keats writes, how silent comes the water round that bend, not the minutest whisper does it send to the o'erhanging sallows. Blades of grass slowly across the checkered shadows pass. Why, you might read 2 sonnets ere they reach to where the hurrying freshnesses I preach, a natural sermon o'er their piddly beds, where swarms of minnows show their little heads, staying their wavy bodies against the streams, to taste the luxury of the sunny beams tempered with coolness. What seems a rather odd and arbitrary measure of time, how long it takes to read 2 sonnets, takes on greater significance when we conceive of this streamlet as the site of multiple kinds of mediation. There is the negation of the whispering from the water's movement, a sort of anti-sensory sensation, like the little noiseless noise among the leaves from the poem's opening lines. There are the blades of grass intermingling with the shadows of the tree branches, which calls to mind the scene of writing in the epistle to Keats' brother George, wherein the stalks and blades checker the poet's tablet with their quivering shades. And then there are the sunny beams which convey their warmth to the minnows through the medium of light as it gets altered by water's refractive properties. So the water's surface thus serves both as a barrier separating 2 realms and as a medium for the movement of meaningful experience across that barrier. We see tasting, delighting, preaching, and figuratively at least, reading. Keats's temporal unit of sonnet reading time poses a relation between the fluvial natural processes and the mediated experience of reading sonnets in a book. So Keats's poetics of secretion, then, operates in this manner. We encounter an image of the separation of realms in which things function through fundamentally different logics. The minnows wrestle with their delight through a differently mediated experience of the sun than that of the human observer above the surface. Secretion separates, but it does so while also enabling propagation, dispersion, exchange, or the interchange of favors, as Keats has it. Even if there is no fully captured experience replicated from one realm to another, through the particular logics of translation that different media instantiate, some transfer between realms nonetheless occurs. We may not become wavy bodies struggling against the stream, but the imaginative transfers occurring through multiple forms of mediation nonetheless have their claims on real, if virtual, being. And it's not only in the so-called good poems of the volume where such dynamics play out. I find some of Keats's most complex and profound thinking on mediation in what are usually seen as sort of the worst of the worst. Take, for instance, the specimen of an induction to a poem, characterized by Levinson as the most excruciatingly arrested of all Keats's poems. And of course, this is entirely accurate, right? That is not wrong. It's an induction to a poem that doesn't exist, and only a partial induction at that. But by the end of this fragment of a prelude to a ditty of no tone, the poet, despite his aching desire to tell a tale of chivalry, ends by resting in hope that future poetry may come at some point. And that future verse is characterized through a list of natural objects which are elsewhere in this poem and elsewhere in this volume, metonymically associated with poetry itself. So the scene of wide plains, fair trees, and lawny slope, the morn, the eve, the light, the shade, the flowers, clear streams, smooth lakes, and overlooking towers. Now, those overlooking towers, presumably reflected in these smooth lakes, are perhaps the only hint that any progress has occurred in this poem, given that the poem's opening signal of Keats's poetic impotence, the lance, which points slantingly, is also reflected clearly in a lake with the young ashen boughs against which it rests and the half-seen mossiness of linnets' nests. This sad, pitiful lance pointing slantingly and sloppily slant-grimed with chivalry gets transformed into the more potent image of reflected towers in the poem's final line, but at that point, any sense of prowess to come is undercut by the poem abruptly refusing to continue. Again, however, I think we see attentiveness to the connection between this watery surface as medium and the possibility of poetic textual mediation. The linnets' nests and their mossiness are only half seen, both because of their obscurity in the trees, but also because they are seen through a reflective, altering process. And as Shelley claims in A Defense of Poetry, mediums reflect and enfeeble before they communicate. And I can't help but hear in linnets a bit of wordplay on lines, as if Keats were naming a truncated kind of verse of poetry of tiptoes instead of feet. So his poems may not be fully formed of lines, like a mature poem such as Lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, but they are at least linettes. Okay. So through attention to such playful and self-conscious registering of poetry's own mediation, I read many of these poems as engaging with what Roman Jakobson calls the phatic register of communication. These are those instances of communication which test the functioning status of the channel or medium of communications. The old mic check is my go-to example for this. Is this thing on? So the 1817 volume can then be sort of read as an extended poetry check, checking the status of the poetic medium. And the scenes of reflective watery surfaces then can be seen as functioning as metaphorical explorations of the concept of mediation, which exists alongside instances elsewhere in the volume of the more direct examinations of literal communications media like books, visual art, etc. Another less well-regarded entry, The Imitation of Spenser, features nothing but a poem born out of a scene of mediation. This poem's little lake features round its marge, of course suggesting the margins of a page, reflected woven hours in the sky that never lowers its middle space. The second stanza presents us with a kingfisher and a swan, the second stanza presents us with a kingfisher and a swan interacting with the water's surface as medium, while also recognizing that below the surface exists a medium apart, nonetheless capable of intermixing with that above. So the kingfisher sees his plumage bright, vying with the fish of brilliant dye below, and the fish with their silken fins likewise convey a ruby glow back upwards to the realm of the birds. So once again, this scene follows the logic of secretion. We don't fully know what these intermingling media convey to one another, merely exploring the existence of their separated but connected relations constitutes the poem, as we see figured in the final stanza's gentle amity between the glossy tide and the flowery side of the marge. By way of concluding, I'd like to turn to the book itself and its medial particulars, since, as John Barnard has demonstrated in great detail, the book is bibliographically weird in all sorts of ways. So in a manner similar to how Keats is testing the capacity of the poetic medium, I think his book seems to be trying out a variety of bibliographic strategies. For instance, what exactly do these 7 asterisks at the beginning and at the end of the imitation of Spenser accomplish? Presumably, they indicate its fragmentary nature, but why no asterisk for the specimen of an induction? And why with Calidore, a fragment, do we see asterisks only at the poem's fragmentary end? And why 9 asterisks instead of 7? And why on the line instead of below it? There may be reasonable and meaningful answers to some of these questions, though we might also account for them, as Barnard largely does, as simply the result of inexperienced publishers, Charles and James Ollier. And without claiming that there is any intention on the part of Keats or his publishers or printer towards creating this effect, I nonetheless think that the book's bibliographic oddities draw attention to the experience of mediation through which readers encounter the volume's many poems contemplating mediation. In short, the 1817 volume strikes me as analogous to what, in a very different temporal and medial context, is called glitch art or glitch aesthetics. So the volume's commingling of signal and noise through these glitchy bibliographic elements ought to be understood in concert with the poem's self-reflexivity around mediation. Now, of course, the book I've been showing you, projected on the screen behind me, is not self-identical with a copy of the printed book, and not only because it is a projection of a copy from the University of Wisconsin, digitized by Google and made available via Hopkins Trust. It's also because it's actually a digitization of a facsimile copy printed in 1927, based on a copy held at the British Library. And I draw attention to this fact because doing the work of commemoration requires not only that we contemplate 1817 and 2017, but also that we understand the modes and instances of continual engagement, mediation, and remediation that happen in the spaces and times between and through which we do our work now. This particular digital object also demonstrates in new ways the logic that the poetics of secretion have attempted to gloss today. It connects while also separating itself from the original British Library copy. It imperfectly replicates. For instance, the facsimile does not include the half title and the printer's address that's in the original book, and it has several more blank leaves than present in the original. Now, it potentially keeps that connection hidden unless we attempt to understand how Hopkins Trust comes to tag a book as published in 1817 when it actually dates from 1927. And if we attune our ears in the proper ways, we may just catch some of the secrets whispered by this wondrous thing. This replica of a particular copy of Keats's first book includes a remediated inscription from the original's one-time owner, Frederick Locker Lamson, who notes on the book's blank leaf his recollection of dining with Robert Browning on 20 February 1869. As the men chatted, perhaps while reading some of Keats's poems together, Browning commented upon the volume, noting that it was, quote, a copy of this edition of John Keats's poems that was found in the bosom of the dead body of Shelley. Of course, Browning is off a little bit. It's the 1820 volume that Shelley had. Nonetheless, this remarkable moment of commemoration, Browning recognizing Shelley and Keats's linked afterlives, and Locker Lamson's inscription preserving a small part of Browning's role in continuing those afterlives, comes to us through a layered experience of separate and interassimilated media, including multiple books and multiple acts of remediated copying. And I hope that my approach to the 1817 poems has shown that we can properly call such a complexly mediated experience Keatsian. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my two predecessors for their papers. It's marvellous to hear them. I'd also like to thank John Buck and his colleagues for inviting me and for organising this. And I'd also like to thank Jack Fincher and John Barnard, on whose work I'm hugely dependent in this paper, Indeed, as I begin it, I marvel at my own shamelessness in presenting it to you, given how dependent it really is on their work. Nonetheless, it goes. In the midst of a well-documented life, the origins of Keats's first book remain shrouded in confusion, and that has had the effect of coarsening what little we understand of a crucial moment in his creative life. This brief paper attempts to marshal what is now understood of its making and explores some consequences of lingering misconception. We perceive this episode in the sketchy hither-thither manner of a patient awakening from anesthesia because of the paucity of evidence. The main culprit, indeed the only culprit, is Edmund Ollier, son of Keats's first publisher, Charles Ollier, a keeper of the flame with an overzealous interpretation of his role. Shortly after Edmund's marriage to Emily Dorell in 1875, he urged him to put a lighted taper to the family archive. Up in smoke went proofs of Shelley's books, copies of Ollier's correspondence with inter alia Shelley, Keats, Leigh Hunt and Lamb, and the valuable account books containing full details of print runs, sales figures, and author payments. As a result, we will probably never see the whole elephant, and what little we can deduce about publication of Keats's first book has to be deduced from the shreds and tatters that escaped Ollier's pyromaniac compulsion. The most important occurs in a letter by Leigh Hunt, not mentioned in print until as recently as 2006. It speaks of a new publishing house, quotes, just about to commence in the persons of two most respectable and intelligent young men, whom I should wish, if possible, to serve by introducing them to the public in good company. Its date, the 11th of December 1816, provides us with the earliest moment at which we can consider the Olliers as comprising a publishing house, and therefore the earliest at which they might have commissioned Keats's poems. Hunt's avuncular reference to a firm just about to commence, that of Ollier and Ollier, signals assumption of the cherished role of patron, while the good company was himself and Rimini, that faux medieval tale of murder rendered in thumpingly end-stopped heroic couplet. L'homme est le style, and Hunt's was louche, epicene, studied and contrived. Perhaps the poem's content, which seems to many readers a distant relation to Byron's, stimulated sales. At any rate, Rimini sold out within weeks of its first appearance in spring 1816, much to the delight of its publisher, John Murray, who handled it as if it had a severe case of pox and declined to reissue it. Instead, he had the most rabid of his cultural commissars, John Wilson Croker, secretary to the Admiralty by day, poet maudit by night, perform a hatchet-swinging autopsy on it in the pages of his house journal, the Quarterly Review. Bruised, though not unbowed, Hunt formed a consortium to bring out the hungrily awaited second edition, and by December had decided to give the Olliers a place in his chariot. I Stood Tiptoe Upon a Little Hill was among the last works to be finished for Keats's new book, not long after the 17th of December, when its author told Charles Cowden Clarke he would finish it in one more attack. Partly on that basis, delivery date for printer's copy of Keats's Poets 1817 is estimated to have been within 2 weeks of that, probably on or around the 30th of December 1816. These datings can only be provisional and are subject to alteration should further evidence appear, but they are the best we can determine and indicate Keats was obliged to complete the 2 long poems that began and ended the volume and copy out its entire contents for the printer within no more than 3 weeks, possibly less. What's more, he fitted the work round his working hours at Guy's Hospital, that is to say, on weekday evenings, Saturday afternoons, and all of most Sundays. It must have taken the discipline of an anchorite. This is a more compressed schedule than most biographers indicate. Robert Gittings, Andrew Motion, Kelvin Everest, and R.S. White preferring to date commission of the book to late October, giving Keats 8 weeks rather than 3. But that cannot be right, as Charles Ollier was still working as a banker in November 1816 and not then commissioning books. Keats's contract with the Olliers obliged him to cover production costs, the usual method by which poetry was published. The amount concerned was sizable. Keats needed to find between 29 and 50 pounds, depending on whether the print run was 250 or 500. For some idea of values, bear in mind that a London bricklayer earned £30 a year in 1817. Keats's efforts to find that sum, or more, were not eased by the fact that he was by now living on credit. Once you realise he financed his book's production, other things make sense. The engagement of Charles Richards as printer, for instance. Not yet a master printer, Richards was an apprentice who for several years had been trading on the side, and the work he did on Keats's volume indicates an experience. Poems 1817 contains a preliminary blank leaf, cancelled title page, no contents page, a single anonymous leaf at the end, and an amateur typographic botch that caused the half title bearing the word poems to crash the first page of I Stood Tiptoe. Ineptitude apart, Richards was a good choice of printer because of cost. His status presumably kept his prices low. Most biographers think the Olliers descended on the boy genius as Zeus came to Danae in a shower of gold. But the evidence suggests the opposite. For the Olliers would have calculated that if 475 out of 500 copies of Keats's book sold, they stood to make £14, 5 shillings and 0p, enough to make it a worthwhile punt. But they published on trust and hearsay, not on a thorough knowledge of the work, and it's clear that when they saw it, they were disappointed. We regret that your brother ever requested us to publish his book, they told George Keats, or that our opinion of his talent should have led us to acquiesce in undertaking it. We are, however, much obliged to you for relieving us from the unpleasant necessity of declining any further connection with it, which we much would have done, as we think the curiosity is satisfied and the sale has dropped. By far the greater number of persons who have purchased it from us have found fault with it in such plain terms that we have in many cases offered to take the book back, rather than be annoyed with the ridicule which has time after time been showered upon it. In fact, it was only on Saturday last that we were under the mortification of having our own opinion of its merits flatly contradicted by a gentleman who told us he considered it no better than a take-in. The harshness of this seems shocking, in part because these sentiments stand in sharp contrast to biographers' claims that in late 1816 Keats was a star pursued through London by publishers desperate for his writings. Robert Gittings reported that, quote, Charles Ollier, who with his brother James ran a bookselling and publishing business in Welbeck Street, was, quote, anxious to do new poetry. Keats began to think in terms of a volume. Andrew Motion says Keats's first meeting with Hunt, which he dates to mid-October 1816, led to an acquaintance with, quote, Charles and James Ollier, who had recently started a publishing firm in Welbeck Street and who immediately began asking about his own publishing plans. Kelvin Everest says that Keats's new friends included Ollier, quote, introduced by Clarke, who was already publishing Shelley and declared himself anxious to publish this new rising young star. Keats began to think of making up a volume of his poems. R.S. White says that, quote, Hunt even arranged for a friend Charles Ollier, who was a musician and poet but had recently decided to join with his brother James in book publishing to print a first collection of the poems Keats had written up to this point. Thus was born the project of publishing poems 1817. Ollier's letter to George Keats has been available since 1900, exhumed and published by that most Dickensian of figures, the forger and part-time rag and bone man, Harry Buxton Foreman. It suggests that, on the contrary, no one was anxious to publish Keats's first book, including the Olliers, and what little status Keats had in a status-obsessed society did not enhance his publishability. What was he exactly? A qualified apothecary, the kind of common tradesman most Londoners encountered in poorly lit shops surrounded by deer antlers, herbs, and mummified crocodiles. An apothecary, that most comic of quacks, who, moreover, in December 1816, aspired to the status of dropout. If he had any reputation at all, it was as the nonentity whose first book appeared thanks to his association with Leigh Hunt, exemplary monster of the literary world, celebrated ex-con banged up for his intimate, if rough, handling of the Prince Regent, self-advertised crony of the wife-beating ephebophile Lord Byron, and editor of the Examiner, most prominent of the liberal Sunday papers. Ambitious for a slice of the second edition of Rimini, the Olliers would have agreed to publish Keats, Hunt's acolyte du jour, because they knew it would grease the wheels, which is why those, quotes, two most respectable and intelligent young men commissioned poems 1817 by a part-time poet no one had heard of shortly before the 11th of December 1816, not because they thought him a genius. Today, Rimini looks sophomoric alongside Isabella, the Eve of St. Agnes, or La Belle Dame sans Merci, and even the most frenzied efforts have failed to redeem it from the frantic and elaborate life support systems of critical and biographical puffery without which it would long ago have vanished. But no one in 1817 saw that, and when Keats's book failed to sell, the Olliers' rapid dismissal would have been surprising to no one. By then, the second edition of Rimini was in production, and their place in Hunt's consortium confirmed. The agreement to publish Keats had served its purpose, and they were pleased to relinquish their claims on an author who had become an embarrassment. The loss was marginal, their investment being confined to giving the book shelf space at their newly opened shop. They did not even shell out for the "this day is published" advertisements in the newspapers. Shelley did that, relieving pressure on Keats, a generous act given that he counselled Keats against publication. Most reviews of Keats's volume were favourable, some by friends, but had scant impact on sales. The Olliers had no hesitation declining any further connection with Poems 1817 and conveyed most remaining copies to Keats's new publishers Taylor and Hesse, who still had them in 1824, a fate consistent with that of Endymion, 1818, remaining copies of which were sold as waste paper in 1821, and that of Lamia, Isabella, the Eve of St. Agnes, and other poems, 1820, which failed to sell half the initial print run. As Calvin Clarke noted of Poems 1817, the book might have emerged in Timbuktu with far stronger chance of fame and appreciation. The whole community, as if by compact, seemed determined to know nothing about it. Literary fashion was against Keats and remained so throughout his lifetime. The success of such versifiers as George Crabbe, Samuel Rogers, and James Montgomery, that Praetorian guard of retardataire whose assumption of the mantle flung across the second half of the 18th century by the long-deceased titans of early 18th century Grub Street entailed little, if any, intellectual reassessment on the part of the style police of Britain's journals and reviews, none of which helped Keats, whose serpentine, shamelessly enjammed, rhyme-led couplet looked inept alongside Pope's industriously manicured, hypertensive cadences. A genuinely innovative approach to technique misconstrued as a self-defouling language game, not to mention his uneven course of development, reinforced the apprehension Keats was another never will be, to join the undistinguished army of never-has-beens thrown up by the modish appetite for youth. That, coupled with the unprocessed sewage of dissatisfaction served up by customers to the Ollier's Welbeck Street shop, confirmed the suspicion they had been hoaxed. Yet, in early December 1816, the Olliers thought Keats's poetry more than hypomanic masturbatory claptrap. And why? Because of Leigh Hunt's Examiner essay Young Poets, which included what we would call a reader's report on Keats's back catalogue. He has not yet published anything except in a newspaper, but a set of his manuscripts was handed us the other day and fairly surprised us with the truth of their ambition and ardent grappling with nature. Hunt then ran complete text of On First Looking into Chapman's Homer as representative, which it wasn't, but that was not the point. To endow something with a pedigree is to make it marketable, and that was what Hunt did for Keats's poetry. Keats was a sideshow to which Rimini was a three-ring circus, not the other way around, and he knew it. That galvanized him. Keats liquidated everything he had and generated printer's copy to a breakneck deadline. The myth emphasizes Keats's confidence, but that conceals the reality. No writer is immune to self-doubt, and none was better placed to acknowledge the unevenness of his work. After reading and rereading it, he must have begun to apprehend with dismay his poem's persistent and self-conscious sincerity, the terrible earnestness with which they addressed the world, their repetitive and unrelieved smokability. More than anyone he heard in its cadences the tics, tremors, and twitches first encountered in Hunt's dandified arabesques, which explains in part why the poems were not the triumphant efflorescence described by biographers. Instead, it enclosed Keats in the grim oubliette of physical and mental strife from which he never really emerged. Quotes, I fought under disadvantages, he remarks of this moment, and that was no understatement. Though licensed to practice independently as an apothecary at his 21st birthday, that is to say, at the end of October 1816, he clung to the comparative security of Guy's as late as the spring of 1817. Yet biographers remain attached to the mythos of the newly sprung tumescent Mozartian talent emergent in late 1816 as the toast of London cognoscenti. At its most florid, Nicholas Rowe's recent biography describes a celebration on the evening of the 17th of December 1816, by which time work on the printer's copy of Poems 1817 must have been underway, when Keats, quotes, this is Nicholas Rowe, proclaimed a Saturnalian revolution in his life. He was determined to become a full-time poet and was already preparing his first book. George, Tom, Cowden Clark, Severn and Reynolds were on hand to witness Keats set his course for poetic fame. Rowe inscribes Keats's character with a simplified legibility, quenching the thirst for that operatic wholeness of life and art that a myth-hungry readership demands of its martyred icons. Though aware of its speculative nature, Rowe is sufficiently persuaded to entitle his chapter Saturnalia. Keats's supposed readiness to embark on such a gaily pretentious exercise has to be set against the evidence, such as what we know about the laurel-crowning episode at Hunt's cottage. Rowe's gloss on that is suggested by the description of Keats at the end of the evening walking back to London. Quotes, in a cloudless spring sky, the stars of the Pleiades were twinkling brightly. Less sanguine, Everest suggests the evening alerted Keats to, quotes, a mannered, trivializing, and frankly embarrassing quality in Hunt's influence. But embarrassment, however frank, does scant justice to Keats's recoil. In his Ode to Apollo, written immediately after, he asked the Greek patron of music and poetry, quotes, where slept thine ire, when like a blank idiot I put on thy wreath? Or was I a worm, too low creeping for death? Self-reproach at that pitch is, as Walter Jackson Bate puts it, self-lacerating, and can only have been accompanied by reassessment of Hunt and his monotonous self-congratulatory smugness. Hunt's review of Poems 1817 in the Examiner soured that unease into rejection, beginning with a paragraph describing his promotion of, quotes, a young poet indeed, another example of his desire to keep acolytes in their place through that most public of instruments, his own newspaper, before chiding the young poet for his faults, a passion for beauties and a young impatience to vindicate them. Then there was Keats's habit of drowning his verse in a, quote, superabundance of detail, which, though not so wanting, of course, in power of perception, is as faulty and unseasonable sometimes as commonplace. These belches from the congested gut of Hunt's paternalistic narcissism climaxed with studious and insincere praise of the beauties of Keats's book, which, Hunt remarked unpersuasively, quotes, not only outnumber the faults 100-fold, but are of a nature decidedly opposed to what is false and inharmonious. Even then he could not resist enumerating further depravities. He wants age for a greater understanding of humanity, he lamented, before dragooning Keats into his crusade against, quote, the morbidity that takes the productions of the late poets. Happy poetry preferred, he entitled an extract from Sleep and Poetry, as if Keats's purpose was to take up arms against the glum, melancholic Wordsworth, before slapping its author on the back for, quote, his little luxuriant heap of verse. This was likely neither to reverse the fortunes of a book no one wanted to buy, nor recall its author's waning loyalty. When Keats next wrote to Hunt, quotes, I could not talk about poetry in the way I should have liked, because I was not in humour with either his or mine. And who could be surprised? After all, this is less the conduct of someone who, several months before, had proclaimed a Saturnalian revolution in his life than of its antitype, someone burdened by awareness of their own marginality. Whatever its failings, Poems 1817 was a milestone in Keats's creative life, not least for revealing to its author a shortcoming he knew he must amend, his smokability. Hardly anyone could resist pointing out its flaws, but that is less striking than its difference in intensity, articulateness, and radiance from the poetry of Keats's maturity, which is that of degree, not kind. The principal distortion of biographical accounts of Keats is that they lodge him firmly in the spotlight at this moment, which is to say, not where he actually was, and not where anyone would have placed him at the time. Biographers seem unable to help anticipating what was to come. Keats's undoubted maestrohood, something created not out of celebrity, commercial success, or scandal, and invisible to British readers until 1848, when Richard Monckton Mills published his poetry for the first time since his death. Their proleptic desire to read his posthumous success back into his lifetime has had the effect of obscuring the crucial insight that Keats's apparent failure, a failure he acknowledged and found acutely disabling, gave him time and opportunity in which to acquire the gravitas that would flourish in the art of his maturity, something notoriously difficult for young writers to achieve, however serious-minded they may be. In spring 1817, his publisher's lack of confidence, borne out by poor sales, seemed to augur failure. Only when that is understood can we apprehend the potency of his resistance, informed by inner self-belief and a firmly rooted knowledge of his path as distinct from that of Hampstead's caput mundi, whose more leisurely inclinations were determined by the twin schedules of lust and impecuniousness. Keats persevered because his early poems enshrined the unique coding of his imaginative vision, the immaculate conception that would inflect every line of poetry he would ever write, culminating in the understated terribilità of the great odes. Biographers tend to see Keats's reaction to the mock coronation with its self-condemnation of blank idiot and worm as quasi-Oedipal, and the parasital impulse is hard to ignore. But they sometimes omit to notice that the Ode to Apollo begins with an apostrophe. God of the golden bow and of the golden lyre, and of the golden hair, and of the golden fire. Since Amy Lowell suggested this was written as a joke, readers have questioned its sincerity. But Apollo was the Greek deity of poetry and medicine to whom Keats dedicated himself years before, and that was why he honoured those similarly consecrated. He can only have resented Hunt's hijacking of sleep and poetry as a rebuke to the taint of Wordsworthian morbidity. Perhaps the curmudgeonly Baron of Rydal was indeed too close to the Tory grandees upon whose patronage he depended, but that hardly justified Hunt's vindication of the excursion, as Keats protested to Haydn, quote, "A man ought to have the fame he deserves." Haydn in turn told his diary, "Keats is the only man I ever met with who is conscious of a high call and is resolved to sacrifice his life or attain it, except Wordsworth. But Keats is more my own age." From the unimpeachable sanctity of that high call came Keats's self-disgust at the laurel brandishing episode that spring evening in Hampstead, a charade saturated in the sweat of Huntian self-promotion. When he published his first book, the Keats we know was still in the making, at a delicate stage in his development. His first narrative of substance, Isabella, was a year away, and no one can have seen what we do now, the fervid, radioactive concentration with which his prehensile vision transformed into words what it was to be human, with its neurotic, preternatural instinct for the untouchability of memory, dream, and half-sublimated desire. The urge to mythologize is understandable, for it signals a preference for poetic reinterpretation modelled on archetype, not on what was actually there, and even less on how it must have appeared to its witnesses. But life as lived is not predetermined and refuses to conform to pre-existing models. The supposed exaltation of December 1816 and enthusiasm at the Olliers are the inevitable byproduct of a compulsion to map our own inclinations onto those of the past. Instead, as one writer has it, our duty is to try to see as contemporaries did, judge them on their own terms, not as prefiguring some, to them, unknown future.
We began a couple minutes late, so I think we have time for a few questions. Okay.
This is directed to Jonathan, but it sort of morphs into some things that Brian raised. I guess one term that was sort of at the edges of your talk, but never really got it articulated, is immediacy. And it seems to me that's partly because Keats hasn't quite reached his moment of immediacy. So in a way, I'm wondering whether the question of occasion still has a kind of drag of mediation on it. I'm not trying to pun, but I think that there's a way in which you were trying to wring as much of the now out of that occasion as possible.
Right.
But it seems to me that Brian's account sort of may give us some reason why that now doesn't quite materialize in the form that I think you want it to materialize in. But obviously you've got a teleological argument that's looking ahead.
Yeah, so you're saying that occasion, by the very use of that word, it sort of, there's a kind of encumbrance of, if we name something an occasion, then it is plugged into some form of framework that may not be a narrative, but special, makes that, moment special somehow, right? And
yeah.
So, yeah, that's really interesting. I think, there are lots of terms sort of haunting this paper, and I haven't quite worked them all out yet, but I think one reason I suppose I want to hang on to occasion is that immediacy never actually happens, right? I mean, it doesn't, it doesn't actually exist, right? So it seems to me that I'll have to think about this, but I guess my response would be occasion may be that which gets us as close to possible, or that marks Keats's attempt to get as close as possible to that. So that's a really helpful way.
Yeah, and I would just add to that in Yohei Igarashi's article that I mentioned in the paper, he's talking about Hyperion. He says the reason why Keats gives up Hyperion is that he recognizes immediacy isn't a strategy that's going to work, that he's like getting as close as possible to this kind of immediacy, and then realizes, no, that it has to be rethought through some other form of conscious and self-reflexive mediation. So I would sort of agree, right, that the occasion suggests that possibility of immediacy while at the same time kind of undercutting it, especially in something like the written on a blank space at the end of Chaucer's, which is, right, that's in the Examiner, I think, like a week or two after the volume is published, and that has like a little introductory note from Hunt, and then it's got this title that gives us this very specific situating of that occasion, and then the poem itself is all about reflecting on the mediation of reading that book. So,
I mean, one way to sort of fold my argument into yours, or vice versa, is to recognize that the 1820 volume is a more sophisticated kind of occasionalism, right? That it's aware of its own mediations in a way that's not quite as, so in that sense, weirdly, the 1817 one is more immediate because it doesn't quite recognize, right, his resistance to Hyperion as a fragment, the unfolding of these sort of temporalities in the odes. There is something different going on. But I think, I'm still trying to draw the through line and say it begins here.
Seems 1820 seems a better produced book as well. I mean, which sort of
material.
Yeah.
Well, along those lines, the immediacy, I was curious because contingency seems to operate obviously throughout all of yours, and Duncan's paper illustrates the dark side of contingencies in terms of economic considerations and so forth. And so I was wondering too, because we talk about reflection and so forth, there's also a lot of shadows, tracing and so forth, and sometimes in the very passages you articulate. And I was wondering if you guys would speak to that element of the sort of the darker side of Keats, that is definitely present in the volume itself too, in these sorts of contingent, perhaps pseudo-immediate ways, if not.
Well, I mean, I love the idea in Duncan's paper of just focusing on how marginal Keats is, right? That he's the sideshow. And when we construct our narratives about Keats, we want to see him as the central heroic figure. So I don't know if thinking about contingency in that sense it's necessarily dark, but sort of actually that gets to a kind of lightness, I guess, right? That like Keats is just this young guy, and to try and like recapture that level of like inconsequence of it is actually, that helps me to think of Keats as the funny young poet about town, doing sonnet contests and making puns and all that. So I don't know, I take it to the light side actually.
Okay.
I would resist the binary, I suppose, and existing in light and shade, and welcome joy, welcome sorrow, writing from the comma between those two. I think in some ways what Keats has taught me, I suppose, and I hope teaches my students, is the way in which contingency as such, it is what it is, and in those moments of darkness, there's life. I mean, you live up until the moment you don't. And I think Keats, among other romantics, was really, really good at that. So that sense of the sort of opposition of light and shade, or dark and light, I think Keats is dark. I think he is also joyful, and I think those things are not mutually exclusive in him. And I think that's part of how his figuration, his formal operations work, because they refuse to a light, or a dark, if you will.
Can I maybe take a left-hand turn into something that's a little bit political? Because something that I feel like you've all given us a very modern Keats in the 1817 poems through these notions of contingency and disruption and this kind of constructiveness. And I'm wondering about disruption as a form of kind of artistic politics that's maybe a little bit more kind of that underlies this volume in ways that maybe kind of speak to how he's using the aesthetics as a kind of disruptive practice. I wonder if you felt that when you were kind of writing this.
Are you suggesting that Keats is not modern?
No, I'm saying I think he is.
Okay.
No, I'm saying that I think that you've given us a really modern Keats because of this disruption, and I'm wondering if there's a political edge to it.
For me, there is, for sure. Yeah, I think he is more relevant now than he was 8 months ago. And I think that commitment to figural revolution, even within a poem, has a political valence, and not just. And so sort of what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is not just the sort of, hey, look, because we have the political Keats that has been given to us so vividly, but to sort of loop back into the ways in which his formal processes, both within poems and within volumes, and then volume to volume, are actually themselves, that they constitute a kind of ongoing political act that we can have access to if we're looking askew at the political Keats that's been given to us by Jeff Cox.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Perhaps one more question?
Oh, well, this is just to compliment Duncan for really giving us a sobering report on how much Keats's compressed career gets us to retroject and recruit the 1817 poems into future Keats. And it's so easy. You're telling us somebody that Keats could not have become Keats. In another construction, he was better known by Shelley's Mythology and Adonais for 20 years, really, until Milne's volume came out, and The Home of Generation was reading Keats in different circumstances. Duncan, can you say a little bit more about how the Olliers got Leigh Hunt from Murray? I mean, was Murray in the position of dumping Hunt after Rimini, and the Olliers were there just to catch the fall?
Yeah, Murray didn't want to publish the second edition of Rimini. He really, and I suspect, didn't want to publish the first edition either. He only did it because Lord Byron told him to do it.
So he was dedicated to Byron.
I think he thought it wasn't going to sell, and probably, Leigh Hunt was a bit of an unmentionable, and he didn't really want to be associated with him. And of course, the moment he paid off Leigh Hunt, he got John Wilson Croker to swing his hatchet at it in the Quarterly Review, and that tells you everything you need to know about Murray's attitude. So Hunt was then in a situation, because the copyright reverted to him, of trying to set up a consortium that would publish it. And the first thing he did was go to Constable, who didn't want it. And then he went to a guy called Triphook, who had a shop in St. James. And he often bought books at Triphook's. And so did Charles Lamb and Leigh Hunt and other people. In fact, Hobhouse was Triphook's lodger. And Triphook said he would go in, but he needed other people to put some money in. And that's how the Olliers got sucked into this. But the Olliers were not known as publishers. I mean, I think Leigh Hunt knew Ollier socially, and I think he probably said, I'm looking for a publisher, and Ollier said, oh, well, I've always wanted to be a publisher. Why don't we do it? But I don't have any money. And so Leigh Hunt said, you don't have to put any money in. I'll put your name on the top of it. It's all right. So the Olliers didn't put any money.
And that was the Olliers' first book? Was that the first thing they published?
No, their first book was the Shelley book, The Proposals for Reform, which came out a week the 4 Keatses. Just a week.
Well, thank you to our panelists. We'll take about maybe a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the next round. Thank you. I hope that question. No, it was
Yeah, there's residences that you can
How you doing? Long time no see.
Was it last night? I knew I was going to miss it because
Great to see you. I saw you out of the corner of my eye. Where is your previous salary? Or is that political? I don't know. I can't do anything. No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
maybe you'll.
So here is
I've got
key. Last spring, I had a near experience with my own mortality that made me realize.
So, yeah.
Not as much of that.
Pretty scary. But made me think more about after 22 years, thinking so there are some places where you think of, like Colorado, and there are possibilities that you can go to Orange, collaborate with so I had a little conversation with Jeff, but I wanted to say this to you just in case there was. Well, I mean, all I can say is that try to hire Give you the skinny. Because give you
What's our schedule? I knew I was going first, and so there's
any other content.
oh,
We'll try and wait.
okay.
I don't want to get
Yeah, no, that's all the sense from. Thank you again.
No,